Now let's create explosion by using the pyro burst source. So in here, let's create a geometry node and dive inside. And in here, I'm going to add the pyro burst source node. Let's add this, and that will create our this interesting shape for creating the sourcing of for our explosion. And onto the pyro burst source, we have the burst type and it is set to explosion, which is good. And let's go into the maybe initial size. I'm going to just increase the overall size. I'm going to just change this to value of 2.5, and here we have the source. And now let's go into the burst animation, and I think the default animation values are fine. Let's go into the burst component and see what are the attributes that we are creating. We are creating the density, we are creating the temperature, and we are creating the burn. Three attributes. And let's enable the scale over duration, and also let's enable the scale along trailing option. Both of these options to create our this smoothing out of our these animation, fading animation, which will create the natural result for our sourcing. And in here, I'm going to just click on this pyro simulation node to create the volume rasterize node and also create the pyro solver. And now let's hit play, and we see what we are getting with the default values. Let me hit play again, and here we have the explosion. And let's play around with settings to adjust the look of our explosion. First, I'm going to enable my this real-time playback option so that we are visualizing this as real time. And right now it's not real time, that is because we are calculating our simulation. But once we have this blue bar, which means that our simulation has been calculated, I can just hit stop, rewind, and if I were to hit play, now I will get this real-time playback. Okay, let's go into the pyro solver, and in here let's play around with these settings. And in here we have the voxel size. We can lower down the voxel size to create high res simulation, but right now for faster feedback I'm going to just change this to 0.2. and onto the sourcing, maybe first let's go into the collision. And in here right now, as you can see, we do not have any ground plane and our this simulation is going below the ground. So maybe let's go into the ground plane, and onto the y ground plane let's add this close below, which means that below 0 we are adding the ground plane. And let's hit play again, and now we should see that some of the collision happening in here. And with the collision we will get this lingering of smoke, which is always fine, always good. Let's go into the sourcing tab, and in here we are adding the density into our DOP density, and the operation is set to maximum, which means that we are using the maximum value. And I always like to change the operation to add, and let's change this to add. And by doing so, that I know that I am adding the density every frame. And let's hit play, and if I want to create less of the density, I can come over here and lower down this source scale value to manually control how much amount of density I want to add. And that's just the way that I like to work. And for this one I'm going to change the source scale to all the way up to 1, and same thing in here. And we are pulling our this heat source, temperature, volume, same thing in here. I'm going to just change this to add, which means I'm adding my temperature every frame. Let's hit rewind and hit play again. And in here, and here as you can see, by changing this to add, we are getting a completely different look of our explosion, because we are adding more heat, and more heat mean that we are rising our explosion fast. And because of the fast rising animation, our explosion shape looks completely differently. And onto the flame, same thing in here, we are using the maximum operation. I'm going to change this to add as well, and that will create this fire, these flames. And here as you can see, now we are creating more flames, and by just changing these operation, our this look is changing. And let me drive down here, and in here we are adding the velocity, importing the velocity v volume, and we are adding this into vel. Velocity volume inside of DOP is called the vel, and its method is set to pull as well. Let's change this to add, same thing. Let's hit play and let's see what we are getting. And here as you can see, we have this velocity kicking off, and we have a completely different explosion just by changing the source. Now let me stop the calculation, stop this, let's hit rewind, and here the field that we actually skipped, and that is the divergence field. What the divergence will do, it will add the expansion. If I were to disable this by clicking on this option, which means that we are not importing our divergence, and if I were to hit play, and you will see that, let me change my angle, and here as you can see, our this explosion is not expanding. We do not have the expansion effect. And to add the expansion, the divergence field, it will add the expansion. If I were to add this divergence, and here as you can see, I have this value, and in here you will see that our this simulation is expanding. And if I were to, maybe let's increase its value to really exaggerate the effect. I'm going to just change this to 50, and you will see, and here as you can see, we have quite a lot of expansion. And whenever we are going to create the explosion, we will always need to add the divergence, because divergence will add the expansion, and whenever explosion happen, it always expand. And I can control this value. I'm going to just change this value to 300 to really add more expansion. And here as you can see, we have a lot more expansion, and essentially our this simulation is right now breaking, but it's not breaking, it's just expanding too much, and we are getting our slow feedback because of we are dealing with bigger domain size. Bigger domain size mean more voxels, and more voxels mean more calculation time. I'm going to just stop this, and let me stop this. I think it has been stopped, and here as you can see, we have this higher expansion. That is the divergence, and right now we are using the burn as a divergence, and I can create a separate divergence. If we go into the pyro burst source and onto the burst component, let me scroll down. Here as you can see, we are creating these three sources, and in here I can create another fourth volume. Let's create this source, and let's add a divergence in here. And if I were to go into the volume rasterize attributes, let me hit rewind, and here you will see that our divergence field is going to be added as well, because we have used the preset and we are using the expression, and here we have the divergence. And if I were to middle mouse button, we have all of these 5 attributes that now has been converted into VDB volumes. And in here we have this weird viewport visualization. As you know, this weird viewport visualization come whenever we have a vector volume. And in here we have the V, which is a vector volume. I can go into the pyro burst source and just not calculate the velocity, and here you will see that our viewport visualization has been fixed, but we need the velocity because it's just creating a more interesting breakups. So let's keep at this, and because we're not going to render our velocity, we will going to use the velocity to add the motion blur. We actually do not need to care about this viewport visualization because it's not going to be rendered. When we are going to render, it will render just fine. But still, if you don't want to see this weird visualization of the velocity, you can actually hide the visibility of this volume by creating an a visibility node. Let's add an a visibility and click on it. Oh, sorry, add this node down here. And after the visibility, all of my primitives has been hidden. As you know that these VDB volumes, they are in the primitive category. We have this volume and they are in the primitive category. Let's go into the visibility node, and in here I'm going to just say please hide the v primitive. At name is equal to v, it's added this expression, which means that velocity is still there. If I were to middle mouse button, we have our velocity volume, but we are just not visualizing in the viewport. It's hidden, and I can fix this our viewport issue like so. I can go into the pyro source and we have all of our this simulation accurately, will work accurately. I'm just not going to add this visibility node in here, or maybe let's just keep this. It's not going to hurt us. Let's go into the pyro solver, and in here I have created an a, let me go into the burst component. I have separately created an a divergence. Reason we separate all of these components, and as you can see, because our this divergence was working fine, and we are adding the burn into flame, and we were also importing our source burn into divergence as well. It was working fine. So why we are going to create a separate source or this divergence? And that is because I can separately add noise onto my this divergence field, onto my this specific divergence. And after the pyro burst source, before we were to convert this into volume, you know that I can just randomize my attributes. So in here I'm going to just add an attribute noise node to add the noise onto my field, and I'm going to add this. In here the divergence is in a float attribute, so let's change this to float. And in here I'm going to add the divergence, and let's just delete the CD. I don't want to randomize my CD. And into the divergence I can change its value. I'm going to change this to 0 centered, play around with the amplitude and element size. I can also animate my noise. Essentially I am adding the breakups into my divergence. And now I can just go into my pyro solver, and in here onto the divergence I'm going to say not use the burn, but I have dedicated divergence attribute, divergence volume, because we are working with this pyro solver. We have the volume. Let's add the divergence into divergence. Now we are using this breaked up version of our divergence to create a more interesting looking expansion. Let's hit play, and right now it is expanding too much. Let's go into the divergence and let's maybe change this value to the way that it was, and I think it was working fine. And same thing, I can keep adding the attribute noise node to break up all of our fields. Let's add another attribute noise, and let me first, we need to go back at the very first frame, and in here I'm going to, let's say, break up my density field, and I'm going to just remove the divergence from here. I can play around with the different amplitude value, different element size, and I can keep breaking up all of my different attributes before I'm going to convert them into volume to create more interesting shapes. Let's go into the pyro solver again, and in here I'm going to, let's not use that much of our expansion. I'm going to just add a value of 1, and let's hit play. Yeah, I think the value of 1 is fine. And right now the smoke, I think the smoke amount is not enough. So let's go into our this density, and I'm going to just change this value to 5 to add more smoke into my sim. And now more smoke has been added. And let's go into our some other parameter. Let's go into the fields tab, and here we have the dissipation. As you know that dissipation control, this density dissipation control our smoke dissipation. Let's lower this value down. I'm going to lower this value down to 0.01 to have a very low dissipation effect. Let's hit play again, and we will see that lot more smoke is going to be added into our sim. And here as you can see, we have more smoke and it's not going to be dissipated very quickly. And here as you can see, our smoke is staying, and we have this cool looking fire and all of our this smoke. And I can go into my shape tab and I can play around with the noises. And here we are adding the disturbance, and we are also adding the turbulence, and we have the flame expansion also built in here. And maybe let's go into the disturbance value, and in here we have the base block. And you know that this base block this will control the breakups of our this mushroom shape. And if I were to disable this, first let's go back at the very first frame. If I were to disable the disturbance, you will see that we will get a smoother looking mushrooms. And here as you can see, these mushrooms are very smooth because they are not getting disturbed with the noise. So let's add the disturbance, and that will break up all these mushrooms into more interesting shapes. Let's hit play again, and here as you can see, we are getting some nice breakups which are good. Let's go into the look tab in here. Let's play around with the smoke color. I'm going to just change this to a maybe value of something like that. And let me rewind, and let's go into the setup tab, and in here let's lower down the voxel size. Let's start with 0.1 to see the result. And here you can see, by changing this to 0.1, we have this very high res. It's not very high res, but it's a decent resolution. We might need to lower this voxel size value down to create more high res version of our explosion. But right now, I think this value is fine. I'm going to just stop this right here. Let me stop this. And down here, all we need to do is to just add a file cache node in here. Let's add a file cache, connect this, and onto the file cache, just go into the base folder, and in here you can define your location where you want to store your caches. And onto the base name, I always just remove this $ hip name expression, and I always keep this $OS, which means the operator name itself, which means I can just rename this file cache to, let's say, explosion. And you know that this base name is going to be changed to explosion as well. I can click on it, middle mouse button onto this parameter to view the evaluation, and here as you can see, it is evaluating as explosion this name that we have written. That is good. And now in here I can just lower down this overall duration. Let's say let's only cache our first 60 frame, and here we have the start and end frame to change to 60 as well. And in here we need to just press save to disk option to write out our cache data onto our hard drive. And before you write out your caches, make sure to go into the Pyro solver and onto the output tab. Make sure to enable this convert to VDB option and use the 16-bit float to save out your cache size, make your cache size lower. Always enable these two options. And in here you can define which of these fields, these volumes that you want to store. The default values are fine. Let's just keep them as is. Now into the explosion, just save out your caches. And in the next lesson, let's create some materials and render out this explosion.